Launching the Antiquities Act of 1906, President Teddy Roosevelt created the nation's first national monument designation, Devil's Tower National Monument in Wyoming. The important purpose of this act was to preserve, for all Americans, significant pieces of the country's history. Ecology. Geology. And beauty. But unlike America's great national parks, size is not important for monuments. Historic sites and other units of the national park system. Monuments are typically established by presidential proclamation, chosen as their personal memorials of the most special parts of this great country. However, occasionally these units of the park system are established by the direct action of Congress. Some are big, some are small. Some garner large budgets and staff, others next to none. And some eventually gain national park designation. America's treasures tell the story of the nation's past and present glory. During conquistador and explorer Hernando de Soto's early 16th century expedition in what would become the southeastern United States, he encountered Native American cities of great wealth, cities equal to any other in the Americas. These were the cities of what archaeologists call the Mississippian culture. The cities were marked by the construction of large, truncated earthwork pyramid mounds, or platform mounds. Mounds still visible and preserved today in many places. This earthen work construction practice of America's native populations was preceded by two earlier mound building cultures: the effigy tradition and the Hopewellian tradition. Today, from the air, much of Appalachian, Ohio is a heavily forested ecological and cultural unit in the southeastern part of Ohio. A section of the country that belongs to the remote and sparsely populated western foothills of the Appalachian Mountains and the Appalachian Plateau. It is one of the most biodiverse temperate forests in the world. Hardly the place for a pilgrimage to one of the oldest and most sacred places in the nation. But there it is, a group of beautifully enclosed burial mounds of the people who lived here 3,000 years ago. On March 2, 1923, President Warren G. Harding established the Mound City Group National Monument, located on the banks of the Scioto River near Chillicothe, Ohio. Then on May 27, 1992, Congress authorized the legislation that renamed Mound City Group National Monument Hopewell Culture National Historical Park. The Mound City Group is the only fully restored Hopewell earthwork complex of the many earthwork complexes discovered in the north-central part of the United States. It is a national treasure. Here, visitors can enter the sacred enclosure and walk quietly among the mounds. Experience the mystery of what it must have been like to gather at a Hopewell ceremonial site 2,000 years ago. LiDAR imaging reveals 24 mounds inside the walled enclosure. None more interesting than the two largest circular mounds and the long mound. Each angle reveals a new look at what would have been a profound experience for the builders. Interestingly, there is no evidence that the builders of the mounds lived within the enclosure. Visitors will be surprised to learn that on top of each mound location, there once stood a building. These pole stumps show where a building once stood. The purpose of the mound earthworks enclosures will forever be unknown. Perhaps some were aligned for astronomical observations. Perhaps they were used as gathering places for distant groups of Indians to reconnect. They were certainly the final resting places for important people in Hopewell society. And clearly, important religious ceremonies were conducted here. The Woodland Period of North American pre-Columbian cultures spanned from roughly 1000 BC to around 1000 AD. The eastern woodlands the Indians inhabited were moderate climate regions extending roughly from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River and included the Great Lakes. They began as hunter-gatherers using spears and atlatls. Gradually, they transitioned to subsistence agriculture and adopted the bow and arrow. The Hopewell were among the earliest eastern woodland inhabitants. However, they were anything but primitive.
They had to keep track of where they were, what they were doing. Everything they wanted, they either had to make or go and dig for or hunt for. And we are dealing with the time prior, in most of these cases, to the time frame of the bow and arrow. We're dealing with that atlatl, that spear thrower. And we're dealing with the thrust spears. We're dealing with a variety of things that these early peoples had. Their knowledge of everything that was around them. I know a lot about plant life and a lot about this, what happens in the woods. I doubt if that would even make 1% of what those people knew and understood what was, what wasn't, what you should eat, what you shouldn't eat, what you could do. They were hunter-gatherers, and I think that really describes things real well.
The first step in the mound building process was to construct a large ceremonial building of poles and bark with a plastered clay floor. Inside the building, ceremonies undoubtedly were conducted. When the ceremony was a funeral, the Hopewell often cremated the body. The ashes or the bodies were entombed on the floor of the building beneath a mound of clay. Interestingly, the bodies of men, women, and children were all found at the Mound City complex. Often next to each body, beautiful works of art were placed. At some point, the building would be purposely dismantled. Then the laborious task of building the mounds we see today began. A process that repeated itself many times as new mounds were added to an area. Eventually, the Hopewell people vanished into the winds of time as new cultures emerged, leaving behind the mystery of how they were able to execute their monumental earthen architecture. The Hopewellian homeland in central and southern Ohio is a place of broad valleys and rolling hills. Game animals abounded throughout the region, including bear, wild turkeys, and most importantly, white-tailed deer. Spring in the forest surrounding the Mound City Group is when the area becomes a wonderland of flowers. Ephemeral spring flowers that last for only a few weeks. Buttercups, lilies, violets, wild phlox, then there are the elegant fern fiddleheads. And of course, the most glorious of all the spring flowers, the trillium. It must have been a visual feast celebrated by those ancient mound builders. For the visitor to Hopewell Culture National Historical Park, the gigantic earthen enclosures of the ancient Hopewell are among the most compelling and mysterious archaeological remains in America's national park system. It is America's great river. The fabric of the American soul has been woven from the many threads of the Mississippi River. It's the backdrop for countless American stories and serves as a constant muse for artists and musicians. The river's poet laureate, Mark Twain, wrote of its upper reaches. Along the upper Mississippi, every hour brings something new. There are crowds of odd islands, bluffs, prairies, hills, woods, and villages. Everything one could desire to amuse the children. Few people ever think of going there, however. We ignore the finest part of the Mississippi. The river and its floodplain support more than 400 different species of wildlife. And of course, it is the most important flyway on the continent. Each year in the spring and fall, more than 325 bird species make the round-trip journey along the Mississippi. The river also played a pivotal role in the recovery of the magnificent American bald eagle, the proud symbol of the nation. When their numbers dwindled to dangerous levels, it was along the upper Mississippi that many of the remaining birds found food and shelter during the harsh winter months. Now recovered, thousands of eagles still congregate here during the winter. The mighty Mississippi, also known as Old Man River, provides drinking water for millions of Americans, and supports a $12.6 billion shipping industry. A shipping industry employing over 35,000 people. It's one of the greatest water highways on Earth, carrying commerce and food for the world. Half the nation's corn and soybeans are barged on the upper Mississippi. But the Mississippi River is also a place of historic significance for the continent. And there is no more historic place than where the Wisconsin River flows into the Mississippi. From the air, the joining of the two mighty rivers looks like an abstract painting. On the western shore of the Mississippi, across from the confluence, sits effigy Mounds National Monument, the largest collection of the most remarkable animal-shaped earthen works on the planet.
We have within the park 206 various kinds of mounds. 31 of those are in the shapes of animals and birds, the effigy, in the shape of. The 31 are broken down where there are 24 of the animal effigies and 7 of the bird effigy. We classify the bird effigies according to, I guess, 2 categories here in the park so we can keep them distinct. If their wings are spread back and like a dive, we list it as a hawk. If they're straight out, we list it as an eagle. And that's our interpretation here.
As the sun sets across the quiet Mississippi, the bluffs on the other side beckon the visitor to experience firsthand the sacred effigies. Located in the state of Iowa, Effigy Mounds National Monument was set aside by President Harry S. Truman in 1949. It is divided into 2 units separated by the Yellow River. The southern unit has the most spectacular effigy groupings, including the jewel of the park, the Marching Bear Group, seen here by LiDAR imaging. Although most of the effigy mounds are only reached by hiking trails, by far the southern unit has the most difficult climbs. The southern unit also encompasses a restored short grass prairie. The northern unit contains the most accessible mound groupings, including the 2-mile Fire Point Loop Trail. The best time to embark upon your journey is early morning, when all is quiet and still. Immediately as you leave the visitor center and cross a short boardwalk, there they are, a group of 3 2,000-year-old mounds. Today, because of a new policy of no longer mowing the mounds to protect them from further erosion, it is more difficult to make out the conical mound shape that was quite visible during an earlier trip to the park. One was found to contain a dozen burial bundles of 1 or more bodies, and another contained an altar, as well as many cremated bones, a common practice during the Middle Woodland Period. As you stand there looking, you feel something special. You know you've entered a sacred place, an ancient cemetery. The first half-mile of the hiking trail is uphill and fairly difficult. The trail winds along rock cliffs on one side and deep valleys on the other. There are no mounds to see along the trail as we climb, since all the effigies are found along the high bluffs. A sound above indicates a deer has just been disturbed. We get a quick glimpse of these elusive animals. Finally, we reach Eagle Rock. From here, we get spectacular views of the Mississippi River. On the slope below the overlook, there is a small relic prairie. A prairie punctuated by blooming purple spiderwort and beautiful prairie penstemon. Continuing on, we come upon the group of mounds known as the Chain of Pearls. A spectacular group of mounds. A group of 19 conical mounds highlighted by the morning sunlight. All arranged in a slightly curved line extending from the main trail to the bluffs overlooking the river. The procession terminates in a large conical mound known as the Fire Point Mound. It was found to contain at least 8 burials, tools made from bird bones and bear teeth, and a copper breastplate. Next, a side trail leads to the Great Bear Mound. At 138 feet long and 60 feet wide, it is the largest known bear mound in the world. And unlike all the other bear mounds in the monument, it lies on its left side. It is difficult to see because of its low profile, but its massive proportions are awe-inspiring. Finally, we come to Little Bear Mound, once outlined by gravel and small stones for ease of viewing. Little Bear Mound was built around 1,000 years ago, at the end of the Woodland Period during the Great Effigy Mound building era. It contained no burial objects, but charcoal at its center indicates great fires were set here for ceremonial purposes. Ceremonial purposes that still reverberate today as glimpses of rituals long forgotten. Satisfied, we head back to the visitor center. In addition to the great effigies along its bluffs, the confluence of the Wisconsin and Mississippi rivers is also a place of major historic significance during the nation's earliest days. Across the Mississippi from the effigy bluffs is San Farol Island, just west of present-day Prairie du Chien. It is a place well worth a visit, with many historic buildings dating back to the fur trade, and the spot where the first European explorers saw the upper Mississippi. Mary Antoine knows the history of the island well.
So the French were always trying to explore the interior part of North America, and in their contacts with the native peoples, they had heard of this great river. And they were looking for the Northwest Passage, a water route to connect the Atlantic Ocean with the Pacific Ocean. And at the same time, the Catholic Church was interested in meeting some of the native peoples. So in 1673, an exploration trip began up in St. Ignace, and Father Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet, who was a fur trader explorer, got in their canoes and they paddled the Fox, Wisconsin waterway to see if they could find this huge river, which was called the Mississippi. And on June 17th, they arrived at the Mississippi River, and Father Marquette later wrote that he was greatly overwhelmed by what they found and its size. The next one of note, it was a man by the name of Nicolas Perrot, and he came here in 1685, and unlike Marquette and Joliet, he turned his canoes into the current and came up the Mississippi. And he stopped here at this prairie, came to realize it was a traditional gathering place of the native peoples of the upper Mississippi. And so he built a fort here, which he called Fort St. Nicholas. And after him, many other French fur trader explorers came to this area.
Though the French were the first to claim this land and waterway, it would change hands a number of times.
In 1756, France and England went to war. Part of it was who was to control the fur trade of the lands west of the Ohio River Valley. We call it the French and Indian War. The Canadians call it the War of Conquest. As a result of the war, France gave up all of its territory in North America except for a few islands in the Caribbean. And so what is now Prairie du Chien became part of British territory. And British traders came here. And it was during the British regime that the first people settled at Prairie du Chien.
Then, as a result of the Revolutionary War, the village became part of the United States, including Fort Crawford, which would go on to play a pivotal role in the early Indian Wars in the Old Northwest Territory, particularly the Black Hawk War of 1832. The war led by the great Sauk chief Black Hawk, who was honored by a statue on the island. Here, there is also a statue of Emma Big Bear, a Native American who lived the way of her ancestors. The ones who built the spectacular earthen works at Effigy Mounds National Monument.